A poor waitress is fired after giving food to homeless twin girls, but a billionaire witnesses everything and decides to change her life forever. The familiar squeak of the back door echoed through the dark alley as Sophie pushed her way into Tom's diner. The chilly October air clung to her back like an invisible cloak, making her shiver as she fumbled for the light switch. It was 5:45 in the morning, 15 minutes earlier than necessary, as always. The fluorescent light flickered a few times before bathing the kitchen in its artificial glow, revealing the realm Sophie had ruled every morning for 15 years. Copper pots hanging overhead shone softly, reflections dancing on the polished stainless steel surfaces. The black and white tiled floor, though clean, showed signs of wear in strategic spots, mostly in front of the grill and the industrial coffee machine. "Good morning, old friend," she murmured to the coffee maker, her fingers gliding over the familiar metal with the intimacy of a long-time companion. The machine answered with a gentle hiss as Sophie began her morning ritual, measuring coffee with the precision only years of practice can bring. The rich, comforting aroma of coffee started to fill the empty kitchen, blending with the lingering smell of grease and disinfectant from the day before. Sophie took a deep breath, letting the familiar scents calm her nerves. There was something reassuring about routine, even when everything else in her life felt uncertain. In the small employee locker room, Sophie swapped her worn-out coat for the diner's light blue uniform. The fabric, though spotlessly clean and pressed, showed obvious signs of use in the frayed seams and faded color. She adjusted it in front of the stained mirror, her eyes inevitably drawn to the changes time had etched into her face. At 45, Sophie could trace the story of her life in the lines deepening around her eyes and mouth. Each wrinkle had its own tale. The laugh lines from years of smiling at customers, the furrows on her forehead from nights worrying about overdue bills, the crease between her brows from trying to stretch minimum wage to the end of each month. "Sophie, honey, you there?" The raspy voice of Mrs. Clara, the cook who was practically an institution at the diner, echoed through the kitchen. "I'm coming, Clara," Sophie answered, quickly pinning up her graying hair into a practical bun. Her nimble fingers worked around the hair tie, its elasticity fading. Yet another item she'd need to replace soon, but not today. Not when rent was late and the power bill threatened to be cut off. Mrs. Clara was already in her post when Sophie emerged from the locker room, her knobby hands moving with surprising agility as she arranged her pots and utensils. At 72, Clara was a force of nature, refusing to retire despite her children's pleas. "You're early again, girl," Clara commented, her wrinkled face breaking into a fond smile. "Couldn't sleep?" Sophie shrugged, starting to organize bread baskets and butter pots. "The apartment gets too quiet sometimes," she admitted. "Besides, someone has to make sure the coffee's ready when the construction guys show up." Clara shook her head, a gesture filled with both affection and concern. "You work too hard, Sophie. You need a hobby, or maybe a cat, or a boyfriend." "Clara," Sophie protested, but couldn't hold back a smile. It was an old conversation between them, as familiar as the hiss of the coffee machine or the clink of cutlery being sorted. The first rays of sunlight began filtering through the diner's fogged-up windows as the construction workers from across the street started arriving. Right at 6:30, as always. Sophie watched them file in, their bright orange coveralls creating a colorful parade against the diner's modest backdrop. John, the foreman, was the first to settle into his usual seat at the counter, his face, marked by sun and time, lit up with a tired smile when he saw Sophie already heading his way with the coffee pot. "The usual, John?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. In 15 years, John had never once changed his order. "You know me too well, Sophie," he replied, his southern accent more pronounced in the early morning. "How's life?" Sophie poured coffee into his favorite mug, the blue one with a tiny chip on the rim, before turning to the kitchen. "2 eggs with bacon," she called out to Clara, who was already gathering ingredients before the order was even spoken. "Life," Sophie sighed, turning back to John. "My rent went up again this month. Mrs. Mercy said it's just the market and she can't help it." John frowned, deep lines forming on his weathered forehead. "That's not fair. You work harder than anyone around here. How much is the increase?" $200, Sophie answered, keeping her voice low so the others wouldn't hear. But I'll figure it out. I always do. If you need anything, John began, but Sophie stopped him with a gentle gesture. You have your own family to feed, John. Don't worry about me. Life's rarely fair, right? But we've still got hot coffee and good company, and that's something. The rest of the construction crew trickled in, each with their usual order, each with their own story to tell. Sophie knew them all by name, knew about their families, their problems, their little victories. Anthony, who had just become a grandfather, Peter, whose eldest son had started college, Manuel, who was saving up for a wedding. The morning went by in its familiar rhythm. Sophie danced between tables with the grace that only years of practice could bring, balancing plates, refilling coffee cups, wiping away crumbs, always with a smile. Her feet ached inside her worn-out shoes, but she barely noticed anymore. Pain had become a constant companion, like the clink of cutlery or the murmur of conversations. The breakfast rush gave way to the calm of 10 o'clock, that quiet period between breakfast and lunch when the diner was almost empty. Sophie took advantage of the lull to sit for a moment on the empty stool at the far end of the counter, allowing herself a brief rest. Her eyes roamed over the diner that felt more like home than the tiny apartment where she slept. The walls, once painted a vibrant yellow, now showed stains of age and spots where the paint had begun to peel. The linoleum floor was worn in places, creating patterns Sophie knew by heart. She knew exactly where to step to avoid the loose tiles that made noise. The formica tables, though clean, showed signs of constant use, small scratches here and there, spots where the finish had faded over time. Some of the chairs creaked ominously when customers shifted their weight, a sound Sophie had learned to monitor carefully, knowing which ones to steer heavier patrons away from. But there was something cozy about this place, something that went beyond the worn decor and aging furniture. Perhaps it was the perpetual smell of coffee and toast, or the natural light that streamed through the large front windows, or simply the countless stories shared over these tables through the years. Sophie, Mrs. Maria's tremulous voice interrupted her thoughts. Sophie stood up immediately, recognizing the hesitant tone of the 80-year-old customer who came to the diner every Wednesday after church. Yes, Mrs. Maria. Sophie approached the table where the older woman sat, noticing her wrinkled hands trembling as she tried to count out her coins. Would you help me with the bill? My eyes aren't what they used to be. Mrs. Maria asked, a slight blush tinging her lined cheeks. Sophie sat beside her, pretending not to notice when the count came up a little short for the coffee and buttered toast she always ordered. Don't worry about that, Mrs. Maria, Sophie whispered, putting the coins away and giving the woman a small hug. You've been our most loyal customer. Fate's all taken care of. You have a heart of gold, dear, Mrs. Maria replied, her faded blue eyes brimming with tears. God will reward you. Sophie just smiled, helping the older woman up and accompanying her to the door. When she turned around, she found Thomas, the owner, watching her with an expression she knew all too well. You can't keep doing that, Sophie, he said quietly, his small dark eyes fixed on her. Business is business. We can't just give away food. It's just a few cents, Mr. Thomas, she replied, keeping her voice calm despite the growing irritation in her chest. Mrs. Maria's been coming here for decades. Longer than I've worked here. Thomas shook his head, his thinning hair moving slightly with the motion. Cents turn into dollars, and dollars become a loss. You need to understand how a business works. Sophie bit her tongue to keep from replying. After 15 years of waiting tables, she knew more about running this place than Thomas did. He'd inherited the diner from his father 2 years ago and rarely showed up before noon. But arguing wouldn't help. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of activity. The lunch rush came and went with its own familiar choreography of shouted orders, balanced plates, and tallied checks. Sophie moved on autopilot, her actions swift and precise after so many years of practice. As the afternoon wore on, the golden sunlight of early evening began to bathe the diner's fogged-up windows, painting dancing patterns on the worn floor. Sophie was wiping down the counter, her body aching after another long day, when something caught her attention. 2 small silhouettes moved on the other side of the window, hesitant and wobbly like frightened birds. Sophie narrowed her eyes, trying to see more clearly through the stained glass. Her heart froze for a moment as the figures approached the door. They were two little girls, so identical that for a moment Sophie thought her tired eyes were playing tricks on her. They couldn't have been older than 4 or 5, their small, grimy faces framed by dark, tangled hair. Their clothes, though once clearly chosen with care, were now dirty and worn. But it was the look in their eyes that twisted something inside Sophie painfully. The same mix of fear and hunger she knew far too well. She'd seen that expression many times in her own reflection as a child, on days when her mother worked 3 different jobs and still struggled to put food on the table. A flash of memory hit her full force, herself at 6 years old, standing in front of a bakery with the same hungry look. The smell of fresh bread torturing her empty stomach while her mother worked tirelessly, trying to keep a roof over their heads. She remembered the shame, the humiliation, the constant fear, feelings no child should ever know. The girls entered the diner hesitantly, their tiny hands clasped together as if each feared losing the other. Immediately, Sophie noticed the reactions of the few customers present. She saw discomfort in their eyes, heard the murmurs start up. One lady pulled her purse closer, as though 2 small scared children might be a threat. Her heart pounded against her ribs as her mind quickly tallied how much money she had in her purse. Not much, just a few crumpled bills and some coins she was saving for bus fare that week. But maybe it would be enough. Thomas was nowhere in sight, likely in his office doing the day's accounting, or more likely, watching some game on his tablet. Sophie knew the standard procedure in such cases: call the police or social services, keep the kids there until authorities arrived. It was the correct, safe, expected thing. But as she watched the 2 girls shyly approach the counter, their empty stomachs audibly growling in the tense silence that had settled over the diner, Sophie felt something inside her break apart and reassemble. 15 years of caution and thrift, of saving every penny, of turning a blind eye to the world's injustices, none of it seemed to matter against those frightened, hungry eyes. In one smooth motion, Sophie grabbed 2 kids' menus she normally only gave to paying families. "Hi, sweeties," she said softly, keeping her voice low and kind, as if trying not to scare off 2 wild birds. "Would you like to sit down?" The twins exchanged looks, a silent conversation passing between them with the intensity only twins seemed to share. The one on the right, or was it the left, gave the tiniest nod, so subtle it would have been imperceptible to anyone less observant. "Come with me," Sophie whispered, guiding them to a table in the back, away from curious and judgmental eyes. It was a table that usually stayed empty, partially hidden by a large artificial plant that had seen better days. "I'll bring you something to eat, okay?" Another silent nod. The girls sat together on one side of the booth, still holding hands as though they feared the world might tear them apart if they let go. Sophie's heart squeezed tighter at the sight. In the kitchen, her hands trembled slightly as she prepared 2 generous plates of spaghetti with meatballs, the most filling, cost-effective meal on the kids' menu. She added extra veggies and 2 large glasses of milk. Her fingers hovered over the cocoa powder, normally charged as an extra, before adding a generous spoonful to each cup. "What are you doing, Mrs.?" Clara asked quietly, watching her with a mix of concern and understanding in her tired eyes. "What needs to be done?" Sophie replied simply, balancing the plates. "Sometimes in life, Clara, we have to choose between doing what's safe and doing what's right." When she returned to the table, the girls were exactly as she had left them, sitting very close together, as if trying to occupy as little space in the world as possible. Their eyes widened at the sight of the food, a mix of longing and fear that made Sophie's heart ache even more. "It's okay," Sophie assured them, placing the plates in front of them. "You can eat. The chocolate milk is on the house." It was like a dam broke. The girls began eating with a speed that broke Sophie's heart, though, she noted with a sad twist. They tried to use their utensils properly, a sign that someone at some point had cared enough to teach them good manners. Sophie kept busy, serving other customers, always keeping an eye on the twins. Her stomach was in knots, knowing that any moment Thomas could appear and discover what she'd done. Every time his office door opened, her heart leaped. And then, inevitably, it happened. "Sophie!" Thomas's booming voice cut through the diner's chatter like a knife. "What is going on here?" Sophie squared her shoulders, bracing herself for what she knew would follow. Thomas stood beside the twins' table, his face red with anger, his beady eyes fixed on the nearly empty plates. "In my office. Now." Sophie cast a reassuring glance at the girls before following her boss. The words she heard next didn't surprise her, but they still hurt like a punch to the stomach. "You're fired." 3 simple words that, on any other day, would have been devastating. 15 years of service ended with a short sentence in a small, poorly lit office. Sophie should have been panicking. Her rent was overdue, bills were piling up, and the thought of being unemployed at 45 was terrifying. But as she pulled off her apron and grabbed her purse from the locker, she felt a strange peace wash over her, as though after 15 years, she was finally doing something that truly mattered. She returned to the main area of the diner, where Thomas now stood by the twins' table, his loud, authoritative voice echoing in the sudden hush. "You need to leave," he was telling the girls, who had shrunk even further into their seats, their small bodies visibly trembling. "They're coming with me," Sophie declared, her voice firmer than it had ever been inside that establishment. There was no tremor in her words, no hesitation in her steps as she approached the table. It felt like the whole diner had frozen to watch the scene. Sophie could sense their gazes, some pitying, some admiring, many disapproving. "Mrs." Clara stood at the kitchen door, silent tears streaming down her wrinkled face. John, who hadn't yet left for work, stood ready to intervene if necessary. But for the first time in her life, the opinions of others didn't matter. Sophie held out her hands to the twins, who grasped them without hesitation, as if they somehow knew, by that instinct only children have, that they could trust her. "You'll never find work in this town again," Thomas yelled as they walked toward the door. "I'll make sure of it." Sophie didn't reply, there was no need. Instead, she kept her head high as she led the girls out of the diner into the late afternoon air, which was starting to cool. The sun was setting as they stepped onto the sidewalk, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Sophie had no idea what she would do next, how to pay her bills, where to find another job. Her future, which had seemed so predictable in its monotony just an hour earlier, was now a complete unknown. But as she felt the small hands clinging to hers, she knew she'd made the right choice. Sometimes, she thought, an ordinary day is just the prelude to something extraordinary. And sometimes, losing everything you have is just the start of finding something you never knew you were looking for. The last rays of the sun danced on the diner windows as the trio walked slowly down the sidewalk, a middle-aged woman in a worn uniform and 2 identical little girls. It was surely a sight that drew the attention of passers-by, but Sophie no longer cared about the looks. For the first time in a long while, she was following her heart, and that was all that mattered. Paul Miller didn't draw attention when he didn't want to, and he rarely wanted to. Seated in the most inconspicuous corner of the diner, wearing a plain grey sweater and dark pants, he looked like just another customer having a late afternoon coffee. His Patek Philippe watch was hidden beneath his sleeve, and his handmade Italian shoes could have passed for any department store pair to an untrained eye. He observed everything from behind the rim of his black coffee, a surprisingly good coffee for such a modest diner. Over the past hour, his watchful eyes had followed the middle-aged waitress as she moved between the tables with a grace that can only come from years of experience. Sophie, he'd heard the others call her. Something about her intrigued him from the moment he entered. Maybe it was the way she smiled. Not the artificial grin of someone forced to serve the public, but a genuine smile that reached her eyes. Or maybe it was how she discreetly overlooked a few missing coins from elderly customers' bills. The arrival of the twin girls changed everything. Paul watched, apparently engrossed in his digital newspaper, as the drama unfolded. He saw the exact moment Sophie's expression shifted upon spotting the children through the window, the momentary hesitation, then the resolve in her eyes before she acted. His fingers, which would normally be firing off a dozen emails on his high-end smartphone, lay still on the table as he witnessed her act of kindness. As CEO of one of the country's largest tech companies, Paul was used to people calculating every move, always expecting something in return. Sophie's selfless act was like a ray of light in a world dominated by transactions. Her confrontation with the owner made his jaw tighten imperceptibly. Paul knew men like Thomas, small dictators in their small domains. How much would it cost to buy this diner? The thought crossed his mind before he could stop it. But no, that would be too obvious, too direct. Years of building an empire had taught him that sometimes the best investments require patience. When Sophie was fired, something within him shifted. A memory long buried under years of board meetings and quarterly reports resurfaced. It was 1989, and Paul was only 12. His mother had just lost her job at the factory, and the tiny apartment they called home was about to slip through their fingers like sand. He could still smell the curry from Mrs. Patel's apartment next door when she knocked on their door that cold winter night. "I can't accept this," his mother had said, tears in her eyes at the thick envelope Mrs. Patel was pressing into her hands. "It's not charity, Jennifer," the Indian woman had responded firmly. "It's an investment. When your Paul grows up to be an important man, he'll remember this moment." That money had been enough to keep them in the apartment for 3 more months, long enough for his mother to find another job. Mrs. Patel never allowed them to repay her, even years later when Paul tried to return the favor with generous interest. "Some debts," she said with a mysterious smile, "can only be repaid by helping others." Paul blinked, returning to the present. Sophie and the twins were leaving the diner, 3 solitary figures against the evening sky. He waited a few moments before standing, leaving a tip generous enough to make Thomas's eyes bulge when he found it. With deliberately casual movements, he put on his coat and stepped onto the street. The chilly October air nipped at his face as he watched the trio moving down the sidewalk. His driver, discreetly parked across the street, moved as if to approach, but Paul stopped him with a subtle gesture. Not yet. First, he needed to be sure. So a few yards away, staying within the growing shadows of late afternoon, Paul followed the little group. His Italian shoes, perfect for boardrooms, protested against the uneven asphalt, but he hardly noticed the discomfort. His eyes were locked on the scene before him. Sophie, still in her diner uniform, gently guiding the 2 girls. Even at a distance, he could see how she tried to maintain a strong front, though her shoulders occasionally trembled almost imperceptibly. Paul knew without checking that his assistant was already running a full background check on Sophie and trying to find any information on the twins. A single discreet text as he left the diner had set his information machine in motion. But that wasn't why he was following them. Data could be obtained in countless ways, especially if you had virtually unlimited resources. No, he needed to see something else, something no background check could reveal. He needed to see if Sophie would keep her dignity and determination even when she believed no one was watching. If her moment of bravery in the diner was a fleeting act, or truly part of who she was. He got his answer a few minutes later, watching them stop at a small park. Sophie sat on a bench with the girls, and even from a distance, Paul could see she was trying to comfort them despite her own precarious situation. That was when he knew. That moment, a woman who had just lost everything yet still found the strength to comfort 2 lost children, told Paul everything he needed to know. Taking out his phone, he quickly typed a message to his assistant. "Get everything ready. We're going to help them." Mrs. Patel had been right after all. Some debts can only be repaid by helping others. And now, 3 decades later, it was his turn to make an investment that couldn't be measured in dollars or shares. Paul turned and headed toward his car, his mind already formulating plans. Tomorrow, he would officially enter their lives. But for now, he would let them have this moment together. 3 lost souls who, without knowing it, were about to find a new beginning. On the horizon, the sun continued its inevitable descent, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Paul smiled slightly, reflecting on how life sometimes moves its pieces in mysterious ways. He had walked into that diner looking for nothing more than a cup of coffee, and now he had a new purpose. The cold October wind blew dry leaves along the sidewalk as Sophie sat on the curb in front of the diner, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her. The twins settled instinctively on either side of her, their small bodies seeking warmth and comfort. For a few moments, none of them spoke. The sounds of passing traffic, of people hurrying by, of the world continuing its relentless routine. All felt distant, as though they were in a bubble of shock and uncertainty. "I'm sorry," Sophie finally whispered, her voice trembling. "I should have a plan. I should know what to do now, but—" One of the twins, the one with a small scratch above her left eyebrow, raised her hand timidly and touched Sophie's cheek, where a single tear had slipped out without her noticing. "Don't cry," the girl said, her voice so soft it was barely audible. They were the first words either of them had spoken. Sophie blinked, surprised by both the words and the gesture. Can you tell me your names?" The twins exchanged that silent communication again. This time, the other one answered, her voice just as quiet. "I'm Luna," she said, then pointed to her sister with the scratch. "She's Stella." "Luna and Stella," Sophie repeated, feeling a wavering smile form on her lips despite everything. Stars. Those are beautiful names. Her hands shook slightly as she searched the pockets of her uniform, looking for her phone. She needed to call someone, ask for help, do something, anything. Instead of her phone, her fingers found a folded piece of paper she'd been avoiding for days. The eviction notice. The crumpled paper felt like it weighed a ton as she slowly unfolded it. The words swam before her eyes. Final warning, 72-hour notice, immediate eviction. A wave of dizziness hit her full force. No job, no home, no plan. And now, inexplicably, two children who needed her as much as she needed them. "Ma'am," Luna, or maybe Stella, tugged gently on her sleeve. "Are you feeling sick?" Sophie tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace. "No, sweetheart, I'm just thinking. Thinking about what?" the other twin asked. "Miracles," Sophie replied honestly. "Because I think that's what we need right now." As if answering an invisible command, both girls moved simultaneously, wrapping Sophie in a tight embrace. The gesture was so pure and instinctive that it broke something inside her. The tears she'd been holding back began to flow freely. "Don't cry," Stella repeated, her small hand still on Sophie's cheek. "We don't have anywhere to go either, but now we're together." The simplicity of that statement made Sophie let out a half laugh, half sob. "Yes, we are together." She took a deep breath, trying to pull herself together. "Can you tell me where you came from? Where are your—" "Excuse me." The masculine voice, soft but firm, startled all three of them. Sophie looked up, instinctively pulling the girls closer to her. A man stood a few steps away, tall, well-dressed in a discreet way, with a face that inspired immediate trust, which, paradoxically, made Sophie even more guarded. She vaguely recognized him as a customer at the diner. "My name is Paul Miller," he said, keeping a respectful distance. I saw what happened in there." Sophie stood up quickly, helping the twins do the same. Her knees protested after so long sitting on the cold concrete. "We're not looking for charity, sir," she said, her tone harsher than she intended. A gentle smile crossed Paul's face. "I'm not offering charity, Sophie. I'm offering an opportunity." The way he said her name, as if he knew her, sent a shiver down her spine. "How do you know my name?" "Besides the fact it was on your name tag," Paul asked, his tone gently teasing. "I've been watching you work for a few hours. I saw how you treat people. I saw your kindness to Mrs. Maria, your patience with difficult customers, your courage in doing the right thing even when it cost you your job." Sophie took a step back, pulling the twins with her. "You were watching me." Paul raised his hands in a calming gesture. "Not in the way you're thinking. Let's just say I'm someone who recognizes genuine kindness when I see it. And what you did today, it was extraordinary." "It wasn't extraordinary," Sophie insisted. It was human. Anyone—" "No," Paul interrupted gently. "Not anyone. Most would have called the authorities, washed their hands of the problem. You risked everything to help two children you didn't know." The twins watched the exchange silently, their eyes darting between the two adults like spectators at a tennis match. "What do you want?" Sophie asked directly, too tired for games. "I want to help," Paul answered just as directly. "I have a house that's far too big for one person. I have the resources to help find these girls' family if they have one. And more importantly, I have a job offer for you." Sophie let out a humorless laugh. A job offer from a stranger who appeared out of nowhere. I'm sorry, Mr. Miller, but that sounds dangerous, suspicious? Paul filled in. Yes, I'm sure it does. That's why I suggest we do this properly. He pulled a wallet from his inner pocket and handed Sophie a business card. Sophie took the card with trembling fingers, her eyes widening as she read his name and title. You're the CEO of Miller Tech Corporation. Yes, Paul confirmed, without pride or pretense. You can Google me, call the office number, do all the research you want. I can even call the police right now if you prefer, to formally report the situation and identify myself. Sophie looked at the card, then at Paul, then at the twins clinging to her legs, clearly exhausted. Night was falling, the air growing colder. They couldn't stay on the street forever. Why? She finally asked. Why do you care? Paul's face softened, a vulnerable look flickering across his eyes. Because a long time ago, when I was a kid, someone helped me when I needed it most. Someone who had no obligation to do so. And that person taught me that some debts can only be repaid by helping others. I'm cold, one twin, Luna or Stella, murmured, her voice laced with weariness. Sophie's heart squeezed. It was getting dark, the temperature dropping fast. Her apartment would soon be out of her hands. She had no money for a motel, and any shelter would separate her from the girls immediately. How can I trust you? She asked Paul, her voice almost breaking. You can't, not yet, he replied honestly. But you can trust your instincts, the same instincts that made you help these girls today. What are they telling you now? Sophie closed her eyes for a moment, trying to listen to that inner voice that had always guided her. The same voice that told her to feed the twins, that had led her to stand up to Thomas, that had told her to choose right over safe. Please, the other twin whispered, exhaustion heavy in her small voice. I'm scared to sleep on the street again, and that sealed it. Sophie opened her eyes, meeting Paul's gaze. If this is some kind of trick, it's not, Paul assured her. You have my word, and tomorrow you'll have much more than that. Formal contracts, legal guarantees, everything you need to feel safe. But for tonight, how about we start with a warm place to sleep and a decent meal? Sophie looked at the twins, who could barely keep their eyes open. Her protective instinct screamed not to trust strangers, no matter how well-dressed or seemingly benevolent. But her heart said that sometimes miracles appear in the most unexpected places. All right, she said finally, but on one condition. If at any point I feel something is wrong, we leave. Immediately. No questions, no attempts to stop us. Paul nodded solemnly. You have my word, my car is right over there. He pointed to a black Mercedes discreetly parked across the street. And my driver can confirm my identity if that helps. Sophie took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision on her shoulders. Luna, Stella, she called softly. Do you trust me? The twins nodded in unison. Then let's try this, together. Paul smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his entire face. Keeping a respectful distance, he guided the small group to the car, where a uniformed driver already had the door open. As Sophie helped the twins settle into the soft leather back seat, she couldn't help but think how life can change completely in just a few hours. That morning, she'd been a lonely waitress trying to get by. Now, at nightfall, she was climbing into a billionaire's car with two children she barely knew, yet who already filled a huge space in her heart. The car pulled smoothly into city traffic, leaving behind the diner, the worn-out uniform, the old life. Sophie didn't know what the future held, but as she watched the twins finally relax in the seat beside her, she thought maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something extraordinary. Paul, seated in the front, gave soft directions to the driver, his voice a quiet murmur blending with the purr of the engine. The city lights began to flicker on, illuminating the emerging night with thousands of little artificial stars. Sophie looked out the window, watching her old life vanish in the rearview mirror. A trembling smile formed on her lips as she realized that, for the first time in a long while, she was heading towards something instead of just running away from the past. The twins were already fast asleep, their heads resting against each other, their small hands still clasped tightly even in slumber. Sophie watched them for a moment, marveling at the absolute trust only children seem capable of showing. The car continued its journey through the city, leaving Sophie's familiar neighborhood and heading toward the more affluent suburbs. Through the reflection in the window, she could see Paul occasionally glancing at them in the rearview mirror with concern. "Everything will be okay," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else, and surprisingly, for the first time on that chaotic day, she really believed it. The Mercedes glided quietly through wrought iron gates that opened automatically as they approached. Sophie, who had spent most of the ride trying to process the day's events, felt her breath catch when the mansion finally came into view. It looked like something out of a movie, an imposing three-story structure that blended classic elegance with modern touches. Meticulously kept gardens stretched out in every direction, softly lit by garden lamps that cast dancing shadows on the perfectly manicured lawn. "We're here," Paul announced gently, turning to look at the back seat. The twins, who had woken up in the last few minutes of the drive, pressed their faces against the car windows, their wide eyes reflecting the garden lights. "Is it a castle?" Luna whispered, her voice a mixture of awe and fear. Paul chuckled quietly. "Not exactly, but you'll have all the space you need to play." The car rolled to a stop at the foot of a marble staircase. Before the driver could open the door, an elegant, middle-aged woman appeared at the top of the steps. "This is Mrs. Martinez, my housekeeper," Paul explained, helping everyone out of the car. "She's prepared rooms for you and arranged a light dinner, just in case you're hungry." Sophie barely registered his words, still trying to absorb the magnitude of this place. The entry hall was larger than her entire apartment, with a crystal chandelier that probably cost more than everything she'd ever owned. "This way, please," Mrs. Martinez gestured warmly. "The girls must be exhausted." As if on cue, Stella yawned widely, rubbing her eyes with the backs of her hands. Sophie automatically moved to lift her, but Paul was quicker. "May I?" he asked gently, and after a moment's hesitation, Stella held out her arms to him. Luna, not wanting to be left behind, was soon in Mrs. Martinez's arms. They walked down a corridor decorated with artwork Sophie was sure belonged in a museum, not a private home. Mrs. Martinez led them to a wing of the house that seemed specially prepared for them. "This will be the girls' room," she announced, opening a double door to reveal a space that took Sophie's breath away once again. It was a fairy tale bedroom. 2 canopy beds, done in soft shades of pink and lavender, were placed at opposite corners of the enormous space. Between them was a play area with a dollhouse as tall as Sophie's waist, building blocks, colorful books, and stuffed animals of all sizes. "And this," Mrs. Martinez continued, opening the adjacent door, "will be your room, Sophie." If the girls' room was a fairy tale, Sophie's was worthy of a magazine cover. A king-size bed with sheets that looked like clouds dominated the space, complemented by a sitting area with plush chairs and an elegant desk. "There are clothes in the closets," Paul mentioned casually, as if it were no big deal. "Mrs. Martinez did her best to estimate your size, but we can get more options tomorrow." Sophie felt her legs go weak. It was all too much. The luxury, the kindness, the complete transformation of her reality in a matter of hours. Sensing her discomfort, Paul gently set Stella on the floor. "Why don't we let you settle in for a bit? Dinner will be served whenever you're ready." "Mrs. Martinez can help with baths and fresh clothes for the girls." Sophie nodded mechanically, still trying to process everything. As soon as they were alone, the twins darted around their new room, their expressions oscillating between wonder and disbelief. "Sophie!" Stella called, her voice more excited than Sophie had ever heard. "There's a bathroom bigger than our old apartment." Apartment. The word hit Sophie like a punch. Just a few hours ago, she'd been worried about an eviction notice on her tiny place. Now, "Come on, you two," she said, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. "Let's take a bath and get ready for dinner." The bath turned into an adventure in itself, with the twins discovering the whirlpool jets and the variety of scented soaps. Sophie took the opportunity to really look at them for the first time, noticing with concern some faded bruises on their arms and legs. After the girls were clean and dressed in soft pajamas that looked custom-made, Sophie finally had a chance to bathe herself. The hot water cascading over her sore muscles felt like it was washing away not just the day's grime, but years of worry and exhaustion. When they finally headed downstairs for dinner, guided through the mansion's maze-like halls by Mrs. Martinez, they found Paul waiting in the dining room. The table was set elegantly but not intimidatingly, with steaming bowls of soup and fresh bread. "I hope you like chicken soup," he smiled, pulling out chairs for the twins. "I thought something comforting would be appropriate." During dinner, Paul kept the conversation light, mostly directed at the twins. He had a natural ease with children, Sophie noticed, asking simple questions without pressing when they were hesitant to answer. Only after the girls were tucked into their new beds, marveling at their rooms, did Paul and Sophie finally have a chance for a real conversation. "You must have questions," he began, leading her to a smaller, cozier sitting room. Sophie sat at the edge of a plush armchair, her hands restless in her lap. "Where do I start?" "How about the beginning?" Paul suggested, handing her a cup of tea. "Tell me more about yourself." And so, in the quiet of the night, Sophie found herself sharing her story. Growing up with a single mom, starting work as a teenager, her postponed dreams of college, her 15 years at the diner. Paul listened attentively, occasionally asking perceptive questions but never interrupting. When she finished, it was his turn. "When I was 12, he began, his gaze distant, "my mum lost her job. We were about to lose our apartment when a neighbor, Mrs. Patels, helped us. She didn't have much, but she shared what she had." Sophie listened as he described how that act of generosity changed his life, shaping his worldview and values as he built his tech empire. "So when I saw you today, risking everything to help those girls, it was like seeing Mrs. Patel again. That kind of selfless kindness is rare, Sophie, and it deserves to be recognized. But offering your home, your clothes, everything," she began. "It's only money," Paul said gently. "What you offered those girls today, compassion, courage, protection, has no price." He paused, taking a sip of his tea before continuing. "Which brings me to the next part. I'd like to offer you a job." Sophie straightened in her chair. "A job?" "At Miller Tech. We'd start you in an administrative role, with room for growth. It includes full health benefits, which would cover you and the twins, and—" "The twins?" Sophie interrupted. "But they're not—" "I'm not legally responsible for them. Not yet. But we can work on that if you want. I have an excellent legal team that can help secure temporary guardianship while we look for their family, if they have one." Sophie felt tears welling in her eyes. "Why are you doing all this?" "Because I can. Because I should. Because those girls chose you as their protector, and you chose them right back. And because—" He smiled softly. "Maybe it's time for me to repay the kindness I received so long ago." In the days that followed, Sophie found that adjusting to a new life was both easier and harder than she'd imagined. The twins blossomed almost immediately, their natural childhood resilience allowing them to adapt with an ease Sophie envied. Her first day at Miller Tech was a whirlwind of emotions. Paul introduced her personally to the staff, causing quite a stir of curiosity. Her new office, she had an office, was bigger than her old apartment, with a view of the city that made her stomach flip every time she looked out the window. Sarah, her new supervisor, was patient and understanding, guiding her through systems and procedures with a kindness that made Sophie feel less lost. Still, there were moments she felt completely out of her depth, especially when executives in expensive suits passed by her desk, speaking in acronyms that sounded like a foreign language. At home, and it was strange how the mansion was starting to feel like home, things were both simpler and more complex. The twins slowly opened up, revealing fragments of their past in offhand comments and the occasional nightmare. Paul was always around but never intrusive. He had a knack for appearing exactly when needed and fading into the background when Sophie needed space. On nights when the girls had nightmares, he'd often show up in the kitchen with hot chocolate for everyone, as though he instinctively knew nobody would be sleeping. It was during one of those nights, after the twins had finally fallen back to sleep, that Paul mentioned school. "There's an excellent private school just a few minutes from here," he said casually, swirling his mug of hot cocoa. "They have a special program for kids who need extra help adjusting." Sophie bit her lip, worried. "A private school? Paul, I can't possibly—" "It's part of your benefits package," he interrupted gently. "All Miller Tech employees receive educational assistance for their dependents." "But they're not officially my dependents yet," Sophie argued weakly. "The paperwork for temporary guardianship should come through this week," Paul said, smiling. "My lawyers are very efficient." And so, just 2 weeks after the day that changed their lives, Sophie found herself in a school uniform shop, watching the twins try on navy blue blazers bearing the gold crest of Windsor Academy. "Look, Sophie!" Luna twirled around, her pleated skirt flaring. "It's like a princess outfit." Stella, always the quieter one, merely smoothed the striped tie with reverence, as if she couldn't believe something so nice belonged to her. "You both look beautiful," Sophie said, swallowing the lump in her throat. At some point during these 2 weeks, she'd stopped wondering when she'd wake up from this dream and started to accept that maybe, just maybe, fairy tales could be real. Paul, who had insisted on accompanying them to buy uniforms, watched the scene with a satisfied smile. "We still need to get school supplies," he reminded them, "and backpacks. Every princess needs the right backpack." The twins squealed with delight, running toward the store's backpack section. Sophie took the moment to step closer to Paul. "Thank you," she said softly, "for all of this. I know I've said it before, but—" "You don't have to thank me," he interrupted gently. "Seeing them smile like that, that's all the thanks I need." Sophie watched the twins excitedly debate which Disney princess was best for their backpack design. It was hard to believe these were the same frightened, hungry kids she'd met just 2 weeks ago. "I'm still scared," she admitted quietly, "that I'm not enough, that I'll let everyone down." That you're afraid to be happy," Paul offered knowingly. Sophie looked at him, surprised. "How did you—" "Because I've felt that too," he smiled. "When my life finally started coming together after struggling for so long, it's terrifying to accept that maybe we deserve good things." "Sophie," Stella called, running toward her with 2 backpacks in hand. "Which one do you think is prettier?" "They're both lovely, sweetie," Sophie answered honestly. "Why don't we get both and you can take turns?" The twins' eyes widened at the possibility, and Sophie realized she was beginning to think like someone who no longer had to count every cent. It was strange but not unpleasant. That night, after the twins finally fell asleep, exhausted but happy with their new uniforms and supplies, Sophie stayed up a while longer in her new room, organizing the day's purchases. Every pencil, every notebook, every piece of the uniform had been chosen with such enthusiasm by the girls. It felt surreal remembering that just 2 weeks ago, they barely had enough to eat. A gentle knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Paul carrying 2 cups of tea. "I thought you might still be awake," he said, handing her one of the cups. "The girls are really excited about school," Sophie smiled, accepting the tea. They could hardly sleep. "Luna's already decided how she'll fix her hair, and Stella wants to sleep in her uniform." Paul laughed softly, taking a seat in one of the comfortable chairs in the room. "That reminds me of my first school uniform after things started looking up for my mom and me. I slept in it for 3 straight nights." Sophie settled into the chair opposite him, allowing herself to relax for the first time all day. "How do you do that, Paul?" "Do what?" "Know exactly what to say, what to do, how to make people feel normal, even in all this—" She gestured vaguely around at the luxurious surroundings. Paul considered the question for a moment before answering. "Maybe because I never forget where I came from. All this luxury, Sophie, it's just stuff. What really matters is people, the connections we make, the moments we share. Like today at the uniform store." "Exactly," he smiled. "Seeing those girls that happy meant more than any business deal I've ever closed." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, sipping tea and contemplating how life could change so drastically in so little time. "They start on Monday," Sophie finally said. "I'm nervous." "That's natural," Paul reassured her, "but they'll be fine. They're strong girls, just like their guardian." Sophie felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. "I still can't believe I'm officially their guardian now. The paperwork went through so fast." "My lawyers are efficient," Paul joked with a wink. and it helps that you've already formed such a strong bond with them. The social worker was impressed at how quickly they've attached to you. They're special, Sophie murmured, her eyes filling with tears. Sometimes it feels like they've always been mine. Paul stood up, collecting the empty teacups. Maybe they were meant to be, as they'd say in America. Sometimes families are formed at the most unexpected moments and places. Before leaving, he paused at the door. Oh, and Sophie, you start your new position on Monday, too. I thought it'd be nice if you and the girls started your new journeys together. New position, Sophie repeated, confused. Executive assistant to the president, Paul smiled. After all, I need someone with your judgment and integrity working directly with me. HR will fill you in on the details tomorrow. With that, he left, leaving Sophie in the luxurious armchair, pondering how an ordinary day in a modest diner had turned into the beginning of an entirely new life. Outside, the moon shone over the mansion's gardens, and somewhere down the hall, two identical little girls slept peacefully, dreaming of school uniforms and Disney princesses. Sophie smiled, getting up to check on the twins one last time before bed. Tomorrow would be another day full of preparations and anxiety, but for the first time in a long while, she was genuinely excited about the future, not just for herself, but for the small, unlikely family they were becoming. Her, the twins, and yes, even Paul, with his quiet kindness and boundless generosity. Passing by the girls' room, Sophie found them sound asleep, Stella still clutching the new school blazer. Luna had kicked off her blankets, as she always did, and Sophie gently tucked them back around her. "Good night, my little stars," she whispered, kissing each gently on the forehead before stepping out and heading to her own room. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries and adjustments, but now Sophie knew she wasn't alone on that journey anymore, and that, more than all the luxury in the world, was the real miracle. The first rays of dawn had barely begun to color the sky when Sophie heard the doors of the girls' room open. Quick footsteps in the hallway, excited whispers, and then her own door flew open, revealing Luna and Stella, fully dressed in their school uniforms. "Sophie, wake up! Today's the day!" Luna practically sang, bouncing on the bed while Stella hovered in the doorway, nervously adjusting her striped tie. I'm up, Sophie laughed, sitting up in bed. She'd been awake for a while, actually, her own nerves keeping her from sleeping well before this first day, the girls' first day at school, and her first day in her new position. Breakfast was a mix of excitement and anxiety. Mrs. Martinez had prepared special pancakes for the occasion, decorated with fruit in the shape of smiling faces. Paul was already at the table, impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit. "My little scholars," he smiled, taking in the sight of the twins in their crisp uniforms. "Ready for the big day?" The weeks that followed passed in a whirlwind of new routines and discoveries. At Windsor Academy, Luna and Stella each faced different challenges. Luna, more outgoing, quickly made friends, while Stella, more reserved, initially preferred reading alone during recess. "Ms. Sophie?" Mrs. Thompson, one of their teachers, called after the second week of class. "Could you spare a moment?" Sophie felt her heart clench, worried something was wrong. But the teacher's smile was kind. "I just wanted to mention that Stella has an extraordinary talent for math," she said, showing Sophie some completed assignments. "And Luna, well, come see this." On the classroom wall, a bright drawing stood out, a surprisingly detailed portrayal of the mansion, with Sophie and Paul holding hands with the twins in the garden. "She has a natural artistic gift," the teacher explained. "I thought you'd like to know." At work, Sophie found her own set of challenges and triumphs. As Paul's executive assistant, she realized that managing a busy diner for 15 years wasn't so different from coordinating a corporate schedule. "How do you do that?" Paul asked one afternoon, after Sophie skillfully rearranged a series of conflicting meetings. "Do what?" "Make it look so easy," he smiled, that smile that had lately made Sophie's heart skip a beat. Evenings at the mansion had developed their own comforting routine. After dinner, while the twins did homework in the study, Sophie and Paul often worked side by side, occasionally exchanging glances over their laptops. One night, as the twins slept and Sophie organized some reports, she felt Paul's gaze upon her. "What?" she asked, aware of the warmth rising in her cheeks. You're extraordinary, you know that. The simplicity of his declaration caught her off guard. Paul, no, let me finish, he said, closing his laptop. I watch how you juggle everything, the girls, work, this new life, and you make it look natural like it was always meant to be. Sophie felt her heart pound. It's easy when you have help, she replied softly. Sophie, Paul began, but he was interrupted by a scream from the twins' room. Both of them jumped up at once, rushing down the hall. Stella was in the grip of another nightmare, something that happened less often now, but still sometimes. Luna was already by her side, holding her hand. Shh, it's okay, Sophie murmured, sitting on the bed. Paul showed up moments later with the hot chocolate that always seemed to calm them. Sophie, Stella asked sleepily after the nightmare had passed and most of the hot chocolate was gone, are you and Paul our parents now? The question froze Sophie in place. She looked at Paul, who'd stopped in the middle of gathering the empty mugs. Sweetheart, Sophie began carefully, it's complicated. But you act like parents, Luna insisted. You take care of us when we're sick. Paul helps us with math. You come to our school events. And you look at each other the way Emily's parents do, Stella added shyly. Sophie felt her face grow hot. Paul cleared his throat softly. Girls, he said, sitting on the other bed. Sometimes families are formed in different ways. The important thing is that we care about you very much. But could you be our real parents? Luna persisted, with paperwork and everything. After the twins finally fell back to sleep, Sophie and Paul ended up in the hallway, the air thick with unspoken words. We need to talk, Paul said quietly, guiding her to the study. The fireplace was lit, casting dancing shadows on the shelves. Sophie sat in her usual armchair, watching Paul pour 2 glasses of wine. They're not wrong, you know, he began, handing her a glass. About how I look at you. Sophie felt her breath catch. Paul, let me finish, he said, seating himself in front of her. These past weeks, as months, have been the happiest of my life. Seeing you with the girls, working with you, sharing these moments. Sophie, I was alone for so long that I forgot what it felt like to be part of something bigger than myself. I felt something too, Sophie admitted quietly. But it's complicated. The girls are exactly why we should consider it, Paul finished. They need stability, a family, and we already are a family, aren't we? But what if it doesn't work out? Sophie voiced her biggest fear. What if we ruin everything? Paul set his glass aside and knelt in front of Sophie's armchair, taking her hands in his. What if it does work out? What if it's exactly what all of us need? The next day, Paul arranged a meeting with his legal team. The lead attorney, Dr. Richards, spread several documents on the conference table. Preliminary searches haven't turned up any living relatives for the twins, he reported. Their parents died in a car accident 8 months ago, and apparently they ran away from the foster home where they'd been placed. Sophie's heart ached, imagining the girls alone on the streets for so long. As for joint adoption, Dr. Richards went on, it's not unheard of, but it can be complicated. The fact that Ms. Sophie already has temporary guardianship, and a strong bond established works in our favor. Mr. Miller's financial status and the stable environment also help. And the fact that we're not conventional, Sophie asked hesitantly. Families come in all shapes these days, the attorney smiled. What matters is the children's best interest. In the following weeks, as the lawyers prepared the necessary paperwork, Sophie and Paul carefully explored their growing relationship. Small gestures, an accidental brush of hands, a lingering glance, grew more frequent. The twins seemed to blossom further, sensing the happiness blossoming around them. Stella joined the school's math club, while Luna had her first drawing accepted into a children's art show. It was at that art show, watching Luna proudly explain her drawing to other parents, and Stella clapping for her sister with excitement, that Paul turned to Sophie. Marry me, he said simply. Sophie nearly spilled her water. What? Marry me, Paul repeated. Not because of the twins, or the adoption, or any other reason, but that I love you. I've loved you since that day in the diner, when I saw you risk everything to help 2 children you didn't know. Sophie looked at the twins, at the picture on the wall showing 4 figures holding hands, at this remarkable man who had changed her life in so many ways. Yes, she answered, And it was the easiest word she'd ever spoken. Paul's smile lit up his entire face. Smoothly, he slipped a ring onto her finger. Of course he'd planned this, and Sophie laughed when she realized it was a perfect fit. "I think we have some news to share with the girls," she smiled. That night, after telling the twins about the wedding and their plan to move forward with a joint adoption, which led to shrieks of joy and a group hug that nearly knocked everyone down, Sophie found Paul in the study. "Are you sure?" she asked one last time. "This is a big change, a big responsibility." Paul pulled her into his arms, silencing her worries with a gentle kiss. "I've never been so sure about anything in my life," he whispered against her lips. Outside the study, two small figures in matching pajamas hugged each other, identical smiles on their faces. Luna and Stella had waited so long for a family, and now, at last, they had found not just a home but a place where they truly belonged. A few minutes later, Sophie and Paul found the twins dozing off in the hallway. Together, they carried them to their beds, tucking them softly under the blankets. "Good night, my little stars," Sophie whispered, as she did every night. "Good night, family," Paul added gently, because that was what they were now, a family. Maybe not a conventional one, born from extraordinary circumstances, united by choice rather than blood, but a family nonetheless, built on a foundation of love, trust, and that first act of kindness in a modest diner on an otherwise ordinary day. Fall gave way to winter when Sophie and Paul stepped into Dr. Richards' elegant office that Monday morning. The attorney, a middle-aged man with gold-rimmed glasses and a kind smile, sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, surrounded by neatly organized piles of documents. Sophie gripped Paul's hand as they took seats in the leather chairs. Her heart pounded. This was the moment they'd been preparing for weeks, the official beginning of a process that would turn their improvised family into something permanent and legal. "Well," Dr. Richards began, adjusting his glasses as he gave the papers one last check. "I reviewed everything again this morning. The twins' birth certificates, medical records, school evaluations, proof of residence, financial statements. Everything seems in order." He paused, looking at the couple over the rim of his glasses. "I must warn you, however, that this won't be simple. Joint adoptions by unmarried couples, while not unprecedented, still face additional scrutiny from the system. But we're getting married," Sophie interjected, her engagement ring sparkling under the office lights. "Doesn't that help?" "It certainly strengthens your case," the attorney agreed, "as does the fact you already have temporary guardianship and a proven bond with the girls. Their exceptional performance at Windsor Academy is also in our favor." Paul leaned forward. "What are the main obstacles we might face?" Dr. Richards took off his glasses, an action Sophie had learned signaled serious news. "Well, the first challenge will be an in-depth investigation. Not just criminal checks, obviously not an issue for you, but complete screenings. Financial history, personal references, psychological evaluations." "That seems fair," Paul remarked. "We want to make sure children are placed in safe homes." "Yes, but in your case, there'll be an extra layer of scrutiny due to the unusual nature of the situation. A billionaire CEO and his former waitress, getting married and adopting two children they met only a few months ago. You can expect people to question your motives." Sophie's stomach twisted. Of course people would question it. There were probably already rumors swirling, tabloids speculating about her and Paul, insinuations about her intentions with the twins. As if sensing her thoughts, Paul covered her hand with his. "Let them question," he said firmly. "We know the truth, and more importantly, the girls know it." Dr. Richards smiled, putting his glasses back on. "That's precisely the attitude we need. Now, if you could start by signing these initial documents." The following weeks were a flurry of activity. Social workers began visiting the mansion regularly, observing the family dynamic and asking detailed questions about rules, routines, and discipline methods. "How do you handle Stella's nightmares?" Ms. Thompson, a rather stern-faced social worker, asked during one of her visits. Sophie explained the hot chocolate ritual, the soothing talks in the study, how Luna instinctively knew when her sister needed comfort. "Interesting," the social worker murmured, making notes on her clipboard. What about dividing parental responsibilities? Paul described how they shared tasks. Sophie usually helped with literature and history homework, while he handled math and science. Major decisions were always made together. And do the girls take part in decisions affecting them? Of course, Sophie answered promptly. For instance, they chose the color scheme when we redecorated their rooms, and we always talk about extracurricular activities or changes in their routine. Amid all the evaluations and interviews, life went on. At school, the twins kept shining in ways that made Sophie's heart nearly burst with pride. Luna had joined the art club and was preparing for her first solo show, a series of colorful drawings called My Family. Stella, meanwhile, shocked everyone not only by entering the math contest, but by placing first in her category. "Look, Sophie," Stella exclaimed after the awards ceremony, her eyes shining as she held up her gold medal. "Will Paul be proud?" "He already is, sweetheart," Sophie smiled, hugging her daughter, because that's what Stella was now, her daughter, in her heart, if not yet on paper. "He cancelled 3 important meetings just to be here." Paul, chatting with other parents nearby, caught Sophie's eye and smiled, that special smile that still made her heart leap even after all these months. The evening of Luna's first art show was just as thrilling. Windsor Academy had transformed the gym into a makeshift gallery, with student works displayed on elegant panels. "And this," Luna explained excitedly to a group of admirers, "is my family in our garden. Here's Sophie, Mom, and here's Paul, Dad. And this is me and Stella." Sophie felt tears welling up at hearing Luna naturally use Mom and Dad. Next to her, Paul discreetly handed her a tissue, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Work at Miller Tech was not without challenges. Some board members expressed concern over Paul's personal involvement with his executive assistant. "It's a matter of appearances, Paulie," Bernard Mitchell, one of the senior board members, argued in a private meeting. "The press is already speculating. If something goes wrong with the adoption—" "Nothing will go wrong," Paul interrupted firmly. "And even if it did, my personal life is not the board's concern as long as it doesn't affect my performance. Last quarter's numbers speak for themselves. But it was during a routine visit from Dr. Richards that the first real complication arose. A relative of the girls has surfaced," he announced bluntly, his expression more serious than usual. "Robert Harrison, brother of their late maternal grandmother. He's disputing the adoption and claiming family preference." Sophie felt all the air leave the room. Beside her, Paul remained perfectly still. "Where's he been all this time?" Paul finally asked, his voice controlled but tinged with tension Sophie rarely heard. "Apparently living abroad and just found out about the parents' passing. He's already filed a motion contesting the adoption." "Does he have a chance?" Sophie asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Richards removed his glasses, the gesture Sophie had come to dread. "Legally, blood relatives do have preference in adoption cases unless proven unfit, and Mr. Harrison appears to have a stable financial situation and no criminal record." Dinner that night was tense. The twins, always sensitive to the adults' moods, immediately knew something was wrong. Stella barely touched her food, while Luna, usually chatty, remained silent. "Are they going to take us away?" Stella finally asked, her small, frightened voice shattering the heavy silence. Sophie felt her heart break. Before she could answer, Paul stood, walked around the table, and knelt between the girls' chairs. "Listen to me," he said with a conviction that made the twins sit up straight. "No one is taking you anywhere. Sophie and I will fight for you with everything we have. We're a family now, and families stick together. Understand?" The twins nodded, tears gleaming in their eyes. "Promise," Luna whispered. "We promise," Sophie and Paul answered in unison. But the complications didn't end there. A few tabloids published speculative pieces about the non-traditional relationship between the billionaire and his ex-waitress. One particularly nasty article implied Sophie was running an elaborate con. The company's board increased pressure on Paul, worried about the potential impact on the firm's image. Some shareholders questioned whether he was too emotionally invested to lead. It was at the first preliminary hearing that Sophie finally met Robert Harrison. He was a tall, austere man with the same eye color as the twins, a detail that made her stomach churn. "These children belong with their blood family," he declared in court, his voice dripping disdain as he glanced at Sophie and Paul. "Not with questionable modern arrangements." "Mr. Harrison?" the judge interjected. "I suggest you choose your words more carefully. This court is not interested in personal biases." But the damage was done. Harrison's words echoed in Sophie's mind for days, feeding her deepest insecurities. What if he was right? What if the girls really were better off with a blood relative? Paul found her one night in the study, lost in these dark thoughts. "They chose you," he said simply, sitting beside her. "From that first day in the diner, when you chose to help them even though it could cost you your job, blood means nothing compared to that." Weeks turned into months. Social workers kept visiting, as did preliminary hearings and endless piles of paperwork. Sophie and Paul juggled it all with their jobs at the company and the girls' needs. The date for the final hearing was finally set. On the night before, no one slept well. The twins refused to go to their own beds, so all four ended up in the study. "Tell us the story of how we met," Luna requested, snuggling against Sophie while Stella curled up next to Paul. "Well," Sophie began, exchanging a smile with Paul, "it was just an ordinary day at the diner. They stayed up all night like that, recounting memories, recalling special moments, making silent promises to each other. At some point, the twins fell asleep, but Sophie and Paul remained awake, watching their daughters rest. "No matter what happens tomorrow," Paul whispered, wrapping his hand over Sophie's above the sleeping twins, "we're a family. Nothing can change that." The courtroom was packed the next morning. Staff from Miller Tech filled several rows, including Mrs. Martinez, who had become something of a grandmother figure. Even some old customers from the diner showed up, including Mrs. Maria, who insisted on coming to bless her girl. The twins testified first, their small but determined voices describing their lives before and after meeting Sophie and Paul. Mom, was the first person in a long time who really looked at us," Luna explained. "Not like a problem to fix, but like people. And Paul, Dad never tries to split us up," Stella added. "Some people think we should be the same in everything just because we're twins, but he knows I like math, and Luna likes art, and that's okay. They're our parents," Luna concluded simply. "In our hearts. We just want to stay with them." Sophie went next, her voice trembling only slightly as she recalled that first day in the diner. "I recognized them," she said, "not with my mind, but with my heart. Like some part of me always knew they were my daughters, just waiting for the right moment to meet," Paul testified last, surprising everyone by shedding his usual corporate composure. "Love can't be measured by degrees of kinship," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "It's something you choose to give every day in big and small moments. It's helping with homework even after a long day at work. It's making hot chocolate at 3 in the morning because someone had a nightmare. It's making room in your heart and life for people you suddenly can't imagine living without." When Robert Harrison took the stand, speaking of traditional values and family blood ties, Sophie felt a pang of fear. But then she noticed something. The judge wasn't even looking at Harrison. He was looking at the twins, who stood between Sophie and Paul, clasping their hands firmly. After what felt like an eternity of testimonies and arguments, the judge finally stood to deliver his decision. The courtroom fell silent, tension palpable in the air. "This court," the judge began, his deep voice resonating, "exists to serve the best interests of the children, not the desires of adults, not social conventions, but the well-being of 2 little girls who have already faced too many losses in their young lives." He paused, adjusting his glasses as he consulted his notes. "Over the past few months, I've had the opportunity to review every aspect of this case. I've read each report, each assessment, each testimony. I've observed not just the words spoken, but the actions and interactions of everyone involved." Sophie held her breath, feeling Paul squeeze her hand tighter. "What I found," the judge continued, "was a family. Not a traditional family, perhaps, but one built on foundations of love, respect, and mutual dedication. I saw 2 children who, after significant trauma, have found stability and happiness." I saw two adults who, with no obligation beyond that imposed by their own hearts, chose to open their lives and hearts to these children. The judge directed his gaze at Robert Harrison before continuing. While this court recognizes the importance of blood ties, Mr. Harrison, we also recognize that family is much more than genetics. It's commitment, it's choice. It's love demonstrated through daily actions. Sophie felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Luna and Stella, seated between her and Paul, held their hands tightly. Having considered all the evidence, including the girls' exceptional school reports, the social workers' glowing evaluations, their remarkable progress under the petitioner's care, and most importantly, the clearly expressed wishes of the children themselves, this court rules that the joint adoption is granted. Sophie Miller and Paul Miller are hereby recognized as the legal parents of Luna and Stella Miller. The courtroom erupted in applause and cries of joy. The twins flung themselves into the arms of their now official parents, tears and laughter mixing in a moment of pure happiness. "Are we a real family now?" Stella asked through joyful sobs. "We always were, my love," Sophie replied, hugging both daughters to her heart. "The paperwork just made it official." Paul wrapped his arms around all of them, his own tears falling freely. "Like I said last night, we're a family. Nothing changed that, and nothing ever will." In the midst of the celebration, Sophie noticed Robert Harrison leaving quietly. For a moment, their eyes met, and she saw something shift in his expression. Perhaps understanding, perhaps acceptance. He gave a small nod before slipping out, and Sophie felt one last weight lift from her shoulders. Mrs. Maria approached, her wrinkled hands cupping Sophie's face. "See, I told you God would reward your golden heart, Mrs." Martinez was already on the phone, orchestrating a celebration at the mansion, a spontaneous party. Employees from Miller Tech took turns hugging Paul and Sophie, many of them familiar with the twins from their occasional visits to the office. "Mom," Luna called, tugging on Sophie's sleeve, "can we go home now? I want to draw our new family. Officially new." Sophie laughed, wiping the last of her tears. "Of course, sweetheart. Let's go home." Paul scooped Stella into his arms, while Sophie did the same with Luna. Together, they walked out of the courthouse, where the winter sun shone surprisingly brightly, as if celebrating along with them. In the car on the way home, Sophie looked at her family, her official, legal, true family, and felt her heart overflow with joy. From one seemingly ordinary day at a modest diner had come something extraordinary. A family built not by blood, but by love, by choice, and by a single act of kindness that changed all of their lives forever. The move happened gradually over several weeks in the spring. Although the mansion held precious memories from their first months together, the unanimous decision was that it was time for a new start, in a place that felt truly theirs from the beginning. The home they chose was in a quiet neighborhood, halfway between Windsor Academy and Miller Tech's offices. It was smaller than the mansion, but still spacious enough for everyone to have their own space. The real treasure, however, was the backyard, a sunny expanse that quickly became the heart of the house. "What do you think about planting a butterfly garden here?" Sophie suggested on a Saturday morning, watching Luna sketch in her new favorite spot under an old almond tree. The girl looked up from her sketchbook, her face lighting up. Now 9, Luna had grown into an even more dedicated artist, her drawings evolving from childish scribbles to increasingly sophisticated compositions. "We could plant lavender," she exclaimed, "and those purple flowers Mrs. Martinez mentioned that attract monarch butterflies." "Verbena," Stella automatically corrected, without looking up from the science book she was reading. She had inherited Paul's personal library from the old mansion, a gift that brought her to tears when she found out. Paul, installing a new irrigation system in the yard, smiled at the conversation. "How about we turn this into a science project? Stella can research the best pollinator-friendly plants, and Luna can design the layout." The twins exchanged excited looks. They still did that silent communication unique to them. Even after all this time, those little moments made Sophie's heart tighten with love. Life in the new house settled into a natural routine. Mornings were a choreographed dance of getting ready for school and work, with Sophie coordinating schedules While Paul prepared breakfast, he had discovered a surprising talent for making pancakes in fun shapes. At school, the twins continued to amaze their teachers. Stella, already known for her math skills, was preparing for a big science fair project. "It's about renewable energy," she explained over dinner, pushing her reading glasses up her nose as she gestured excitedly. "I'm going to show how we can use solar panels to power an entire house. With help from Dad, obviously," Luna teased affectionately. "Just the technical part," Stella insisted. "The theory is all mine." Paul pretended to wipe away a proud tear. "My daughter, the future solar engineer." The science fair, held in Windsor Academy's gym, was a roaring success. Stella's project not only won first place in her category, but also caught the eye of several visiting university professors who had come as judges. "Your daughter has a brilliant future ahead of her," one of them told Sophie and Paul after the award ceremony. "It's rare to see this level of scientific understanding in someone so young." Luna, of course, was right behind her. Her first solo art show was scheduled for the following month, featuring a collection of works she called family portraits. "They're not just normal portraits," she explained as she and Sophie arranged them in the school's small gallery. "Each one shows an important moment for us." Sophie looked at the drawings with teary eyes. There was the moment they'd met in the diner, depicted with surprising sensitivity for someone so young. Their first night in the mansion, the adoption day at the courthouse. Everyday scenes, family dinners, afternoons in the backyard, movie nights with hot chocolate. "They're our memories," Luna said softly. "Our story." During the opening of that art show, Paul and Sophie decided it was time for a special announcement. With the twins at their side and surrounded by friends, family, and the school community, they officially introduced the New Beginnings Foundation. "Our story began with an act of kindness," Sophie began, her voice steady despite her emotion. "A moment when I chose to follow my heart instead of what was safe or expected. And that single moment," Paul continued, "that single choice created ripples that changed not just our lives, but showed us how we can impact the lives of others. The foundation," they explained, "would support non-traditional families in the adoption process, offering everything from legal aid to scholarships for children. Because sometimes," Paul smiled at his daughters, "all a family needs is a chance." Wedding preparations became a family project in the following months. Luna took charge of the artistic side, sketching detailed ideas for every part of the decor. Stella developed an impressively complex spreadsheet to manage all the details, something old, Mrs. Maria said on the morning of the wedding, pinning a delicate brooch to Sophie's bridal gown. The brooch, she explained, had belonged to her grandmother and had graced 5 generations of brides. "Something new," Mrs. Martinez added, presenting a pair of pearl earrings she had chosen especially for the occasion. "Something borrowed," Luna offered, extending her good luck bracelet, the one she wore to all her art shows. "And something blue," Stella finished, presenting a light blue ribbon she had calculated to be exactly the right length to weave into the bouquet. The backyard, now in full bloom with the butterfly garden the girls had planned, provided the perfect setting for the ceremony. Climbing roses framed the white gazebo where the vows would be exchanged, and tiny lights had been woven into the old almond tree's branches. Luna and Stella, in their matching flower girl dresses adorned with hand-embroidered butterflies, a special project that kept the seamstress busy for weeks, practically danced with excitement as they helped with final arrangements. When Sophie finally walked across the yard toward the gazebo, with a twin on each arm, the world seemed to pause. Paul awaited her with that same look she had noticed the first day at the diner, that unique blend of kindness and determination that had forever changed her life. The vows were simple but heartfelt, written together by the entire family on a special evening a few weeks prior. "I choose you," Paul began, voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Not just as my wife, but as my partner in all things. I choose to build a life, a family, and a legacy with you. I choose to love you not just in the easy moments, but especially in the hard ones, when our love is needed most." "I choose you," Sophie replied, tears shining in her eyes, "not just as my husband, but as my companion in every adventure. I choose to face every challenge by your side, to celebrate every victory together, and to create a home built on love, respect, and mutual understanding. The twins, who had insisted on adding their own vows, stepped forward. "We choose to be a family," they said in unison, their voices clear and confident. "We choose to love and be loved, to care and be cared for, always and forever." There wasn't a dry eye in the garden when the officiant finally pronounced Paul and Sophie husband and wife. The newlyweds' kiss was interrupted by two enthusiastic little girls throwing themselves into a group hug, drawing laughter from everyone present. The reception that followed was a celebration not just of the love between Paul and Sophie, but of the love that had created and sustained their non-traditional family. There was dancing and laughter, heartfelt speeches, and moments of pure joy. During dinner, Paul asked for everyone's attention for a special announcement. The New Beginnings Foundation was officially launching its first program, a mentorship system for families going through the adoption process. "Because we know," he said, gazing fondly at his family, "the journey can sometimes feel scary, but no one has to go through it alone." Sophie watched with pride as her daughters handed out small flyers about the foundation to the guests. Each flyer featured one of Luna's drawings on the cover, a simple but powerful illustration of hands of different sizes and colors intertwined to form a heart. Later, when the party was winding down and the sun was beginning to set, Sophie found a moment of peace under the almond tree. The twinkling decorative lights glowed softly above her, and she could hear the distant laughter of her daughters playing with other children. Paul found her there, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they watched the garden filled with people they loved. "Happy?" he asked softly, his chin resting on her shoulder. "More than I ever imagined," she replied, seeing Luna share her latest sketches with a group of admirers, while Stella excitedly explained her solar project to some interested guests. "Who would have guessed," Paul mused, "that serving 2 meals to 2 hungry little girls would change our lives like this?" "The universe works in mysterious ways," Sophie smiled, turning in his arms to face him. "Or maybe some people just have hearts too big to ignore someone in need. Like a certain waitress I met, like a certain CEO who decided to give that waitress and her 2 little charges a chance." The next morning, the Miller family rose early despite the late celebration. There was work to be done. The foundation would officially begin operations, and the first families were already scheduled for initial consultations. "Can we help with the interviews?" Luna asked over breakfast, her sketchbook already open beside her. "I want to show them my organization spreadsheet," Stella added. It might help them stay on track during the process. Sophie and Paul exchanged proud smiles. Their daughters had not only overcome their own traumas, but now wanted to help other children find their own happy endings. "Of course you can help," Paul grinned. "After all, you're the experts in turning strangers into family." The morning sun bathed the kitchen in gold as the Miller family prepared for another day together. In the garden, the first butterflies were already visiting the flowers that Luna and Stella had so carefully planted. Sophie looked at her family, her husband scanning emails while trying not to spill coffee on his new shirt, her daughters excitedly discussing the best way to help other kids like them, the house brimming with love and possibility, and felt her heart overflow with gratitude. From one seemingly ordinary day at a modest diner came something extraordinary. A family built not by blood, but by love, by choice, and by that first act of kindness that created ripples far beyond anything they could have imagined. And that, Sophie thought as she joined her family at the table, was just the beginning of their story.